According to two recent government reports, British businesses are subjected annually to 600,000 inspections by 63 different national regulators. On top of this, 2.5 million forms need to be filled out by small businesses on regulatory matters, and a further 2.5 million forms for local authority inspectors. I'm joined today by Rick Haythornthwaite, who's chairman of the Better Regulation Commission and the man charged with cutting through all this red tape. Rick, it's good to meet you. Nice to have you join us. Now, tell me first, how have we got into this mess and what are we doing to get ourselves out of it?
Thank you, Fiona. It's good to be with you. Ultimately, regulation is a product of how society responds to, chooses to respond to risk. And unfortunately, in the past, in the somewhat risk-averse public sector, regulation has been the vehicle of default, often to the neglect of things like standards or codes of conduct.
So what advantages then do standards have over regulation? I mean, they both have this whiff of red tape about them, but presumably it's important to use the strongest tool you have.
Well, standards are, as you imply, just another tool, one of many, but used in the right circumstances, standards can be much more flexible, they can be more supportive of innovation, and quite often they can actually enjoy far more backing of those people for whom they're supposed to apply because they've been involved in the conception and development alongside, quite often, the government itself. I mean, take for example GSM, a critical standard as it applies to our mobile telephones. Here's a great example of international standards being established that have allowed for enormous levels of interoperability without red tape. And quite often, those standards can be as strong as regulations if they are backed up by international disciplines or verification by independent bodies. And that's actually why we like working with important organisations such as the British Standards Institution or the UK Accreditation Service to see how these standards can be developed further.
You say that standards can be more effective than regulation or legislation, but if we start to loosen legislation, what's going to prevent us falling into this Wild West kind of environment?
Well, I think it's important that there are some clear disciplines of compliance around the standards. Sometimes that can simply be self-declaration, or more often that it could also be verification by independent bodies of testing, certification and inspection, where there are high issues at risk. And we have very good bodies such as the UK Accreditation Service that was set up for exactly that purpose. And I think in areas where that are critically important, the government tends to be quite rightly involved right from the outset in terms of establishing the policy and the right framework of standards.
What's the difference for a business between using standards or regulation?
Well, there can be a number of benefits, I think. The first is that one can reach a consensus, a meaningful consensus on quite complex issues quite quickly and be involved in the decisions that are being made. And I think there's another very important area, and that really allows regulators and agencies to take a very differential view in the market. So those operators that are compliant actually can be given varying degrees of autonomy. And you see this, for example, where the Environment Agency and DEFRA recognise in the market the environmental standards around EMAS and ISO 14001 and BS 8555, and it makes a difference. Good leadership is rewarded.
What about the consumer then? What difference does it make to him or her whether quality is going to be ensured through standards or through legislation?
Well, I think just evidence would suggest that at their best, in terms of conveying information around quality that a consumer needs to make his or her decision, then standards are almost always more flexible and less costly a way of actually conveying that information. I think they're often also more intelligible than legislation, and when the consumer is seeking to understand something. And of course you can also support them with some sort of mark, whether it's the red tractor on food or the BSI kite mark as it applies to safety. And of course, there is the added advantage that because quite often the consumer is involved in creating that standard, there is a sense of it uses a language and concepts that truly the consumer understands.
So in essence then, standards can be this useful, flexible tool when it comes to lighter touch regulation. Rick, thanks very much indeed for joining us.